Hello everybody, thank you for being here today at the Northern Institute People Policy in Place seminar. My name is Michaela Spencer. I'm from the Ground Up Research team here at the Northern Institute. And firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on beautiful Werrikee country. This place has been cared for by the Werrikee people for time immemorial, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I also pay my respects to the elders and leaders of all the Aboriginal nations on whose lands people may be joining us from. But today we're going to be hearing from Tracy Woodroffe. I think Tracy is uniquely qualified to be presenting to us about the topic today. She's spent 20 years as a teacher in the Northern Territory, another 10 years as a lecturer in education here at CDU. I first got to know Tracy when she was completing her PhD on the importance of including Indigenous knowledge in pre-service teacher education. And since then, I think you've juggled an enormous load, being a lecturer, creating several amazing research projects, one of which you're going to be talking about today. And you've also just been awarded an important ACE SES First Nations Fellowship. So congratulations on that. And just last week published an article in The Conversation about the funding that's about to come into education in territory, so people can check that out afterwards. But we're looking forward to your presentation today, and so I'll hand over to you to say a bit more about that.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Michaela. So, good morning, everyone. I just want to say it's not going to be so formal this morning, so everyone should just relax. If you haven't got a coffee or something, please grab one. Whatever you need to sort of settle for the next 40 minutes or so while I hold you captive, which happens to be one of my favourite parts about being a teacher or an educator. But when it's your turn to speak, people have to stop and listen for a minute, which is brilliant. So today I'm going to be speaking about one HEP project in particular. So a higher education participation pathways funding that CDU receives has funded two projects that I have been working on. One was completed at the end of last year. So this is just part of the dissemination of the findings. So what you will hear though is a little bit about other projects and the common theme of equity in education, especially for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I'd just like to start out with saying thank you to Michaela for doing that acknowledgement of country as well. And I acknowledge the Werrikee people as the traditional owners of the land that we're on. So just heading straight back into what we were talking about equity in education. It's funny that AITSL, so the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership, make this statement at the top of the slide there, which says Australian education systems were never designed for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, which I find appalling. But it's a reflection of our history, isn't it? And the fact that our most recent history that's reported on more commonly is the journey together that Aboriginal people have with their coloniser and then the people who've come after that to be Australian citizens. And you would hope that as an Australian citizen, the education system of the country that you're in caters for you. And unfortunately, it doesn't. So a lot of my work is about how do we make the Australian system accountable so that it's equitable for all students. So equity research is really an opportunity to drive social change. So I've had that question recently too. You know, what do you enjoy more, working in schools as a teacher, which I love, absolutely love, or working at the university? And really, I think that after all of the experience that I had in classrooms and working with students, I reached a point where I felt that I couldn't impact any more change within the education system from being a teacher, and that it was more important to become a lecturer and to be able to then conduct research within the system. So you can't change a system from being on the outside looking in, because you're not relevant. People won't listen to you or pay attention. It's so much better to be in the system and then making an impact from there. So, you know, part of that was my lecturing in teacher education and equipping mostly non-Indigenous student teachers to know that it was their job to go into classrooms and make a difference as well. So, you know, that I've kind of gone past that now and I'm working within humanities, but that's a really important impact for people to understand. So even if you're not Indigenous, you still have an important job in helping support the way that equity happens within Australia. Okay. So we've already done our acknowledgement of country. I can't do a welcome because I'm not Larrakia. So this is my identity. So I'm a Warramunga woman. So on my dad's side, my Aboriginal heritage is from Warramunga people. So my grandmother is Luritja. So she was from here, this region here. She was born in Fink. And my grandfather, up a bit higher, around Tennant Creek, is Warramunga, or he was Warramunga. So that's where I get that from. And so my family are from, Tennant Creek and Fink River, and I identify always as Aboriginal. I think it's important to state that because a person's knowledge and experience in growing up is how you see the world. So if you've been treated like an Aboriginal person in Australia for the whole of your life, you have a certain perspective on things. You understand things differently. And I'm not taking away from anyone who's discovered their Aboriginal history later in life, but I would argue that it's a lot different than being treated as an Aboriginal person your whole life. So this is what I bring when I do my lecturing and my researching. I bring the Aboriginal cultural heritage with me in my practice and in the way that I conduct myself as well. So it's a personal and a professional thing. So my cultural knowledge and wealth of practical knowledge as well as an educator. So I have those two strings to my bow that I'm very confident with because they come from my own perspectives and understandings, and other people can't tell me that I'm wrong in what I think. Okay, so I've also received, while I'm here at CDU, an excellence awards from the BC in both teaching and learning and research. So I apply my skills and knowledge to those two separate areas of teaching and research, but I would argue they're not actually separate. So I research about education, then I lecture about that as well, and it informs my teaching in that space. So my knowing, being and doing permeate my research and my teaching strategies. Okay, so if you're wondering how an Indigenous person adds to what CDU has, that's what it is. And these are the equity projects that I've been leading. So one of them is a Pathways project looking at how can we get First Nations students beginning a journey while they're still in senior secondary school towards becoming teachers. So it's about that vet pathway and how can we clarify that or make it more accessible to students. And even though I'm talking about these projects, I would like to acknowledge that I'm not conducting them by myself. I work with a team of fantastic researchers on both projects, and that the teams are strength-based in their composition. So they have been put together in a way because of people's particular skills that they bring. to each of those projects. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we have an advisory group who will be introduced to you. So the main project I'm going to be talking to you about is the Pathways one, because that's the one that was completed at the end of last year. But that there is a student experience HEP project that's still running this year. And because I have a fellowship, my colleague, Kate Golbiowska, is actually taking a lead role in completing that project this year, which will be fantastic because we're actually creating First Nations student guidebooks for what to expect when they come to CDU, and they're going to be students here around cultural responsiveness. And also a guidebook for CDU lecturers about best practice in engaging First Nations students here at CDU. So that's around cultural responsiveness in their lecturing practices. So those two publications will be completed this year and will be available for students and lecturers moving forward. So both of those projects are HEP-funded projects. Both of them have to do with engagement with higher ed. So even though the Pathways one I'm speaking to you about today is about senior secondary students, it's really about getting them into a pathway for studying in higher ed here at CDU. So you can imagine is there a play button? Yeah, can you press the button? Thank you, Lana. So there's students on their pathway, their journey, their educational journey, and it seems that at the moment, lots of people talk about barriers. You would be surprised how many people that we interviewed or surveyed actually brought up all of the reasons why students can't access that pathway from vet through to higher ed. So it was a little bit disheartening, but once we collected the data and analysed it, one of our strategies was to code but then recode through an Indigenous women's standpoint theory lens. So that means that instead of a deficit view of Indigenous participation in education, it's flipping that around, and instead of blaming people, actually looking at the system that's meant to cater for everyone and what is it within that system that we could adjust or change or fix that would make it more equitable. Okay, so this is the project that I'm going to mainly be talking about today. So exploring a First Nations pathway from the vet in schools or delivered to secondary students to a Bachelor of Education at Charles Darwin University, because I'm hoping that we will be able to increase student numbers in a way that impacts positively on Indigenous student engagement. So the rest of the research team on that particular project are Professor Linda Ford, Dr. Johanna Plump, and Associate Researcher Pauline Ewan. And this is our lovely advisory group who advise on both those projects and have now come on board for the fellowship. So Linda Ford is an associate, she's an associate professor. Let me start again. Associate Professor Linda Ford is on the advisory group for the other project because she's actually CI on this one. She is an advisory group member on the other project. So Professor Michael Christie, Dr. Michaela Spencer, who you met already, and Dr. Anne Lau, who's seated at the back, is part of our advisory group for our HEP projects, and we appreciate all of their time and expert advice in that space, so thank you. Okay, so this is some of the premise that we started from, okay? So working on this project, what you should understand is, you know, an sort of overview of our Australian teaching workforce. And it's characterised by a distinct lack of parity between First Nations teachers and non-First Nations teachers. So out of all of the teachers in Australia, there's something like 3% of those teachers are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. And when you look at the territory, that percentage per population doesn't really change much. But the composition of the student percentage does, okay? So in the rest of Australia, while only 3% of people, you know, the population overall is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, something like that. When you think of the territory, we have so many more of our population as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And if you're a teacher in the classroom, up to about 40% of students in the Northern Territory are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. And they don't have those role models or those mentors or those visuals around them in schools to see that the teachers are Aboriginal people. Okay, they get to see teachers as a majority of non-Indigenous, and that even is in more of our remote and very remote communities. It's more likely that there's a transient teacher population. The teacher in charge will be non-Indigenous. The AT, so the assistant teacher, is more likely to be an Aboriginal person from that community. And so they, even if it's not intentional, the assistant teacher has a lesser role. Okay, it's as if that person is respected less. The teacher's the one in charge, the head of what happens in the whole classroom, what's going on, and gets paid the most money. Okay, so where is the equity in that when the person who's assisting is most likely a member from the community and will have a high level of language and cultural expertise, but will not be paid at the same standard or level as the perhaps non-Indigenous person who's currently leading the class. So there's a reason why we need to make changes, and the fact that we have yearly teacher shortages isn't just a territory problem. It is a nationwide issue that's being addressed at the moment by the federal government funding in the Be That Teacher campaign, which is about increasing teacher numbers Australia-wide. And in the territory, I would argue that we need more of a focus in that strategy that addresses increasing the number of First Nations teachers, because we would have less of a transient teacher population, perhaps less teacher shortages because you have people permanently within their own communities. And I would argue that you would have someone who could have a strong cultural connection with students that might encourage more engagement as well. Okay, so we can go into that in a bit more detail, but increasing the numbers of First Nations teachers is definitely something that we need to be a part of. So this project, those were the research questions. Is there a clear pathway? No, there's not. Okay. What is the result of our research? What's come out is that some people know a little bit about this bit and this part of the journey and this aspect here, because you're crossing systems between the compulsory education system into tertiary. You know, sometimes the students get lost with that having to enrol bit and that, lack of a transition point, And there's not enough people within that pathway journey that know the whole lot of knowledge to impart to students. So no, there's not a clear pathway. What are the enablers? We'll go through that a little bit later. How are Indigenous students successful in the pathway? No one, according to CDU data, has completed that pathway from VET DSS, delivered to secondary students, through to a bachelor degree at CDU. So that also has something to do with the kind of data that we collect and how students are tracked as well. But students aren't successful in that pathway yet. So are there improvements to be made to engage more Indigenous students? Yes, there are. So if we look at the literature, there's some territory-specific literature that talks about how to employ the right people, how to accelerate and expand programs, develop opportunities and pathways that attract, retain and promote Aboriginal educators. As an Aboriginal educator, as an Aboriginal person working within the education department, I never felt like anyone wanted to retain or promote me, ever. So the Department of Education strategy 2021 to 2025 says there are 7 system priorities, including workforce development, improved cultural responsiveness, and supporting transitions between schools. So people are aware of it, and they seem to say the same things. So everyone uses the same language and talks about the same thing, but nothing's changing. So our Share in the Future, which was also known as the Wilson Review a long time ago now, stated that secondary education is the key to future options for young people and the need for an employment pathway program to be trialled and evaluated in schools should be used to encourage student aspirations. So, you know, we haven't really kept progressing along the path. People say, yes, this is what we need, and then it just seems to stop. Nothing sort of happens in that change space. I suppose that might be an issue when you do consultations. So you consult and you collect a lot of information and you've got your data and you say things, but then whoever makes the decisions about the steps moving forward and about where the funding is targeted will determine where the change actually happens. So nationally, here's some other documents that actually talked about how ATAR alone isn't necessarily used by all students anymore to access university, and that even though that might be offered, it can be challenging to navigate and perhaps isn't well integrated into senior secondary studies. But that secondary students should be provided clear pathways to further learning and encouraged to undertake career education and workplace learning. That workplace learning and that work practices learning is really important. So it's not just about theory anymore. It's not just about students getting those high ATAR scores. It's about preparing students in a practical sense as well for what they're going to find when they go into that workplace. And the Barrett Review, which was quite an important document for its time, suggests that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be supported into higher education through pathways, particularly workforce and vet systems. And that document also highlighted areas of need for First Nations people, such as nursing or health and teaching and education. So have we actually increased numbers of First Nations people participating in higher ed? I would argue not enough, and certainly not targeting those areas. You know, teacher education, have we targeted teacher education as a career of choice for First Nations? I don't think so. So we've already had programs in Australia to try and address that. And one of the most popular ones that people should have heard about is the Mat City program. And that was run through, I think, UniSA. So it was very southern. And I think the most improvements in teacher numbers that they noted was, I think, through New South Wales. So all along the bottom there, not necessarily up here where we have areas of need as well. So even though it was a program with merit, the funding was stopped in 2016, and the final report about the program acknowledges that not all of the outcomes were achieved and that more funding is needed in that space. So there's different concerns about not only transition points, but also the funding and the drive to make sure that change continues to happen. So at CDU, what we looked at was, okay, so what would be a VET course that students might be enrolled in that could lead perhaps into education, into a teacher education degree at CDU. So we looked at the Cert 3 school-based education support, but that course only promotes itself to students as a pathway to an assistant teacher. So again, it's limited in the expectations of students. And there's very few students enrolled in that through CDU as the provider that are identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. So there's a disparity in what we want to do. There's not an accessible pathway for students. And for some reason, there's only limited numbers of students that choose that pathway. And I would argue that perhaps we haven't designed the appropriate VET courses that would prepare students to be teachers, not just assistant teachers. When I say not just, it doesn't take away anything from assistant teachers, but it's definitely a lower pay scale. And I don't see any reason why Aboriginal people can't be in charge and take that next step to be the teacher in control of what they think should happen within a classroom. So something else that came through, especially when we did interviews, was that there's not enough scholarships perhaps or traineeships that would encourage students to take up more of those VET courses as well. So this is just an overview of some of the information that CDU provided for our project. And the reason that 2017 seems to be the only one we're Cert 2 is it's because we're lacking in our Certificate 2 provision at the moment, especially in a course that might be a pathway into teaching. So Cert 3 is there, and then leading through into those other levels, but there's not an easy way for vets, secondary students, senior secondary students to say, okay, I'm going to do this next, I'm going to do that next, I'm going to do this next. And when you look at how it's accessed based on region as well, that's interesting too. So you would expect that maybe, vet would be better suited to more remote locations, perhaps if there's like workshop arrangements or something and people can come together. But it's not like that at all, because it seems that from our figures we've collected that more urban students access to VET courses and training. Most likely because, and this is another response from an interview, students within senior secondary schools that are in remote or very remote can only access courses that have a lecturer going out to the schools, and it depends what the specialisation of that lecturer is. So that depends what students access at the time. So there is an issue with access. And then when you look at how many students are actually completing courses, it looks as if more students have been retained and completing. But why aren't there more Aboriginal students feeling like they can engage with higher ed or engage through those VET pathways and coming across that kind of divide. Apparently there's an academic divide between certificates and then into the higher education academic language or expectations. So the report, Equity Implications of Non-ATAR Pathways, Participation, Academic Outcomes and Student Experience, 2022 found that alternative pathways such as vocational education and training courses, access schemes and enabling programs were increasingly being used by students to gain admission to university, not by First Nations students in the territory. We need to make those pathways more accessible and more visible to students, and I would argue to teachers and schools as well. So a lot of it has to do with the way that I think CDU position ourselves within the territory and what we can provide to our territory citizens, yeah, but also other people throughout Australia or even internationally who like to enrol with us and understand, you know, what it's like learning in our institution. I think that we perhaps are missing a trick in how we're promoting ourselves to senior secondary students about the pathways from VET into higher ed study. So even though we have some additional entry points or bridging programs, there could be more done in that space. So of course we had ethics approval. We also had to get Department of Education approval to conduct research. The team are always helpful when you're working with the Education Department to get approvals or to give approvals. If they have any questions, they always come back and let you know, oh, actually, what about this? You know, how will you do that? That's all good. But then you're kind of at an arm's length because depending on how broad your research is, you don't necessarily get to visit all of the schools that you'd like to capture information from in the region. Is very heavily dependent on perhaps the participation of the principal, because you have to contact the principal and convey the information about your project to the principal, and then the principal decides who they pass that information on to. So out of the research, out of the participant pool, schools were the least number of participants within the response group. So that I found was quite disappointing, because you would want to have a broader group or a larger understanding of what people's perspectives are within a space. So that wasn't necessarily the case. And even though the participant group involved all of these people, the fact that I mentioned earlier that not everyone knows all of the information across the pathway limited what people could respond. So respond with. So the questions that we asked, not everyone knew the answers to all of the questions. So not everyone knew all of the pieces in the puzzle, which is like a big red flashing light. How do you make it clear for everyone what the potential of the pathway is and what each moving part is, who the people are in each of those areas, and how do you ever expect students to be able to know all that information and feel confident in following that pathway? So these are the findings. So they support the need for an articulation of a clear pathway. There was an agreement that participants had not seen an existing visualisation or representation of the pathway. That a visual pathway, though, is not the only component that's needed for students and teachers and CDU lecturers or staff to understand how students might move from a vet course through to studying a teaching degree at CDU. So it requires system, process and practice change. So systemic change, which we all know is quite difficult and takes a long time to happen, especially if there's more people involved, because not everyone has the same priority as you do. So the key will be to coordinate an approach. You know, it would be ideal if we had a specialist team that could work on this for a while together and make this their job to ensure that those pathways were understood by all of those people, and that it was a service that could be accessed by students who were particularly interested in teaching and wanted to know how they could start their teaching journey in senior secondary school and what would they have to do next. So the complication is a lack of awareness and support for students moving from one system to the other as well. So students who enrol in VET, they get an individual student number, and it belongs to that student. So if they wanted CDU to know about it, they would have to disclose the number to CDU, who might then be able to track a student's journey across systems. So the transition points are a difficulty. Greater awareness of student career choices would be good as well. And there seems to be an inconsistency of knowledge. So one of the other key areas that were raised were difficulties that students experience in literacy and numeracy, confidence as senior secondary students moving into from a Cert 2 across to a Cert 3, and then from a Cert 3 across to higher levels of academic expectations. We spoke to staff in student support, the literacy people within the library, and they said that they noticed such a big leap between what's expected for students, even between Cert 2 and Cert 3. So there was perhaps a suggestion that associated courses should be designed with literacy and numeracy learning embedded in them. You would hope that by the time students leave secondary school, they'd be confident with literacy and numeracy. In primary school, students learn how to read and write. As they move into secondary years, they're expected to use those reading and writing skills to learn. So it flips. So by the time they're in the middle years, they're disadvantaged already if they don't have literacy and numeracy skills that they're confident with. And I would argue that not enough of that middle years area is allocated to helping students increase their literacy and numeracy skills. There's not enough space in the curriculum for that. So sorry, we're not talking about that right now. Take me off on a tangent. So there's that old adage that everyone brings up, you know, it's too hard to jump from vet to higher ed. Everyone says that all the time. It's such a common thing that's said. So apparently it still hasn't been fixed. There's still not a clear understanding of how easily we can move from someone changing their study from vet to higher ed. I think that must still have to do with perhaps academic literacy and the expectation that vet courses or vet study might be more practical. It's not without theory, we all know that, you know, there's literacy and numeracy components, of course, to vet. So what is it that limits students then from feeling confident in being able to address the higher levels perhaps of literacy, academic style literacy within higher ed, and how do we make that a smooth transition rather than a bumpy, discouraging one. So in conclusion, our research did answer the questions, so we did find out each of those questions that we asked. So there is a potential pathway for First Nations students. Enablers for success, though, are encouragement and knowledge of school staff, support and sharing of relevant pathway knowledge by CDU staff, literacy and numeracy skills, making easier transitions for students, having role models and mentors would be fantastic. Cultural inclusion and responsiveness built into the development of teacher education courses and delivery. So not just the content, but the way that the educator is delivering the content. So pedagogical change in how that's presented, which of course you would need an Indigenous educator to do this. Type of data collected is wasn't helpful. It didn't help provide us with a clearer picture of students crossing the systems and then being able to find out if students had come from vet to enrolling in a bachelor degree. Our data at CDU says none, but I think that's how we've collected the data, or what data we've collected perhaps hasn't provided enough, maybe with enough confidence in saying, yeah, that's definitely what's happened. So this is an incomplete list of improvements, and something that our study didn't include was student information. We didn't ask senior secondary students. It would have been good to do that, to understand how they feel about participating in VET delivered to senior secondary students, whether as a student they feel there's a clear pathway and they know what that is, whether they feel confident to be able to say, I'm going to start my education journey now in teacher education, and I know that I'll be able to easily transfer that across to RPL when I get to CDU. So what we did was we got a graphic artist, this is only a small part of the diagram, to create that visual map. And what I'm hoping to do is to pass this on to our student engagement team here at CDU, because there is a brilliant group of people who are the future student.
Yeah, we're student recruitment effectively, but yeah, so future students, so we're breaking it up into high schools or mature age.
Yeah, so future student team members, they go out to schools and provide information about courses at CDU. And they also provide information about how students can be recognised for their RPL, and that doesn't have to be an extended study. It doesn't have to be years and years and years of studying something unnecessarily. They could be recognised for the study that they already start in senior secondary school. Our future student team, when they go out and deliver courses on behalf of faculties. So one of the issues is that faculties have to know about our future student team and target the courses that we want students to know about. So on our CDU website, it's a little bit back to front, and it says that secondary schools let CDU know about what VET courses they want their students to participate in, whereas it should be the other way around, and we should have teacher education courses and say to schools, we're targeting this at the moment, this is what we want students to know about, and these are the courses that are available. But we don't have a Cert 2 available at CDU at the moment, as far as I know, but Ruth has assured me that she would like things to happen in a different way. She's on board with our findings of our research, and that she supports our HEP project anyway and understands how important it is to improve the numbers of First Nations people here in teaching at CDU. And our next steps will be, how do we align our practice now to make sure that that pathway is not only clear for students in secondary schools, but also clear here at CDU, and people understand what the processes are and how students move into that teaching degree. So just to finish, I'm nearly finished, I promise. Just to finish, because we were doing HEP research or research funded through HEP, I had the opportunity to apply for a First Nations fellowship through, it used to be NESHE, so the National Centre for Higher Ed and Student Equity. They now changed to the Australian Centre for Student Equity and Success. And my project to continue on with is about talking to those senior secondary students and to find out what they think about teaching and teaching as a career, and how they might promote that to young people, and be able to think of how we can work together to increase those student numbers. So that's it. So increasing the number of Aboriginal teachers in the NT, planning for the future. So myself and Dr. Darren Garvey and Professor Peter Anderson, we have 3 of those First Nations fellowships that were awarded nationwide, and I was very happy to get one for CDU and be able to commence this project. So that's just the new project, targeting increasing the numbers of First Nations teachers. So that's what I'm doing at the moment, leading on from the project that's just finished. Thank you. Not much time for questions. Are there any questions?
Question there from Kim. Yeah. Good question. We know there are numerous barriers that First Nations students face. Did you explore, have others looked at how those who have become teachers negotiated those barriers, how and why they pushed through to become teachers?
Not that I know of that I've done. Linda Ford has a HEP project at the moment, and she's looking at success aspects of First Nations people who've graduated and had success in education. So the project that I'll be conducting now also speaks with Aboriginal teachers, so practicing teachers in the classroom, and there will be either surveys or interviews asking them about their impressions of teaching, what do they find aspects of teaching that are great or fantastic that might promote the profession to other First Nations people, perhaps maybe what they don't find so great, and how we could create promotional material that talks about the fantastic things and perhaps goes past some myths. So no, I don't think we talk much about barriers. My PhD, I spoke to practicing teachers, Aboriginal teachers, and asked them about their engagement with students and how their Indigenous knowledge enhances what they bring to the classroom, and what Indigenous knowledge aspects pre-service teachers should be aware of when they're doing their teacher education. So I don't know about the success ones. I'm sure there have been. Who am I thinking of? Sorry, off the top of my head, I'm sure there's some authors who probably addressed that. Do you think the expectation for students to use academic language in assessment is a barrier? Yes, I think academic language is a barrier for everyone. But I think that, again, it's a systems thing, and it depends whether the system is assessing students on their intelligence based purely in English, or whether there's room for students to be assessed in their first language.
I'm curious, thank you firstly.
No worries.
Thank you. I'm curious that you were talking about senior secondary students and vet pathways into a Bachelor of Education degree. Is there a particular reason why you've chosen to look at the vet pathway into an education degree with RPL versus, say, going through an enabling program and finishing school without having done that vet program and going into a Bachelor of Ed? Is there a reason why you chose to look at the vet course as a pathway into university?
Yeah.
Because I know you're talking about the jump between vet and higher ed. Yeah.
Yeah, so number one, I wanted to think about student aspirations while they're still in compulsory age education. And I wanted them to know that what they do then is really important with regards to career education and the way that you focus on what your next choices are. So when you're in, I don't know, year 10 or something, you might be asked by a career advisor, what would you like to be when you leave school? Why not? If students are already accessing vet courses within the senior secondary system, why not start there for teaching? Personally, I decided when I was in year 6, I was going to be a teacher. But lots of people might not feel like that. So yeah, it was important to think of also how First Nations people, majority of people are directed towards a vet pathway. And so how do we take advantage of that and actually help people feel that they can actually extend that or change that and go into a teaching degree? I just a comment just to finish, and I'm sorry if it's all about me, but I just want to say, as an educator, when you're in front of the room, you're responsible. You have to be confident in what you're doing, what you know, because you're in charge. And that feeling is so empowering. And it just, it's your education, your lesson, your teaching, your stuff that's happening. And why would you delegate that to someone else? I just don't understand. If you could be a teacher, be the teacher. Thank you.